Tonight, you'll leave with what I ask for, Damien said, his voice smooth as polished stone, the kind of calm that made people obey before they realized they were afraid. The private dining room at Bella Vista shimmered under low amber light, crystal glasses catching every flicker from the chandelier, while the city glowed beyond the windows like a field of gold. Claire stood at the edge of the room in a navy coat that had seen too many winters, her hands steady around a cream-colored envelope. Around her, Damien's guests wore expensive smiles that never reached their eyes. They had come to witness another deal, another display of power, another night where the boss of the Moretti family decided the shape of the room simply by entering it. Damien leaned back in his chair, one arm resting along the leather with casual ownership, his dark gaze fixed on Claire like she was already his private problem to solve. "Hand it over," he said, and a few of the men at the table smiled as if they already knew how this would end. Claire did not move. The silence stretched, thin and sharp, and then she stepped forward just enough to place the envelope on the table without touching his hand. "You should open it now," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying through the room like a bell. Damien's smile thinned. He glanced at the envelope, then at her face, and something in his expression shifted, the first hint that he had misread the woman standing before him. One of the guests gave a low chuckle. "Is that supposed to be a warning?" someone asked. Claire's eyes did not flinch. "It's proof." That single word changed the air. Damien's fingers hovered over the envelope, then paused. He had built his world on instinct, on reading threats before they arrived, and now his attention sharpened in a way that made the room feel smaller. Claire had not come here to beg. She had come here knowing exactly who would be watching, knowing the envelope would do what her voice alone could not. Damien tore the seal open with slow precision, as if the paper might bite. Inside was a stack of documents, crisp and brutal in their simplicity, along with a photograph that froze the laughter at the table before it could rise again. No one spoke. Damien's eyes moved once across the first page, then again, slower this time, and the faint color drained from his face. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. Betrayal. The kind that lands quietly before it destroys everything. Claire watched him read, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, as though she had already paid the price for bringing this truth into the light. Across from them, one of Damien's closest men shifted in his seat, suddenly too interested in his glass. Another stared at the tablecloth as if it might open and swallow him whole. Damien turned one page, then another, and the room seemed to hold its breath with him. At last he looked up, not at the papers, but at Claire. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and for the first time that night, his voice was no longer certain. Claire's answer was calm enough to be dangerous. "From the person you trust the most." That was the moment the secret inside the envelope stepped out of paper and into the room, and Damien understood that the woman he had tried to claim was the only one who could end the lie he had been living. The room did not move. Even the chandeliers seemed to hang still in the air while Damien stared at Claire, then back down at the envelope, as if he expected it to change shape in his hands. The men around the table had gone rigid, their earlier confidence thinning into something quieter and far more dangerous. Claire stood with her fingers loosely folded in front of her, composed in the way only someone with nothing left to lose could be composed. Damien slowly drew out the next sheet, and this one was not a ledger or a receipt. It was a photograph, old, slightly faded, but unmistakable. His jaw tightened. The image showed a younger woman in a simple coat, standing outside a hospital entrance with a child no older than 5 clinging to her hand. Damien's eyes narrowed, then lifted to Claire again. "Where did you get this?" he asked, but now the question carried a different weight. Claire's voice remained calm. "It was in the envelope your assistant tried to hide from you." Damien's expression changed by degrees, as if each second was forcing open a door he had kept locked for years. He looked back at the photograph, and the color seemed to drain from his face. Across the table, one of his men swallowed hard. Another finally set his glass down, too carefully, too late. Claire did not move. She simply watched him understand what he had missed. The woman in the picture was his mother. The child at her side was him. Damien's thumb brushed the edge of the photograph once, almost reverently, and for the first time since she had entered the room, Claire saw not the mafia boss the city feared, but a man standing at the edge of a memory he had never been told to trust. That woman, Claire said softly. Spent her last months trying to tell you who took you from her. Damien's eyes lifted slowly, and the air in the room grew tighter, more fragile. My assistant, he said, the words tasting like betrayal before they were finished. Claire gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He wasn't protecting your business, she said. He was protecting himself. Damien turned the page again and found the second document, a transfer record with names, dates, and a signature that made his hand go still. The room watched him read, watched him recognize the pattern, watched the last certainty in his face give way to something colder and far more personal. And when he finally looked up, the only thing louder than the silence was the truth beginning to rise between them, because the envelope had not come to expose a stranger's lie. It had come to reveal who had been living inside his life all along. Damien did not speak at first. He stood with the second document in his hand, the paper rustling softly in the heavy air of the room, while every man and woman nearby seemed to understand that something had shifted beyond repair. Claire remained calm, her expression unreadable, but her eyes never left the envelope on the table. It lay there like a final verdict, thin and ordinary, yet carrying enough truth to change the shape of an entire life. Damien looked from the signature to the dates, then back to Claire, and for the first time since she had walked into his world, he seemed less like a man who controlled everything and more like someone facing a door he had never noticed before. Who else knows about this? He asked quietly. Claire's answer came without hesitation. No one who mattered, she said. Only the people who helped hide it. That made the room even stiller. Damien set the page down, slowly, as if any sudden movement might break the fragile line between the past and what was still possible. The truth in front of him was no longer abstract. It had names. It had signatures. It had years attached to it. And somewhere inside those years was the reason his mother had disappeared from his life without ever being allowed to explain why. Claire stepped closer, careful and measured, and the light from the chandelier caught the edge of the envelope in her hand. There's one more thing, she said. Damien's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt. She opened the flap and removed a small folded note, its paper aged and softened by time. There was no dramatic flourish in the movement, no need for one. The room had already seen enough to know that whatever came next would matter. Claire unfolded the note and held it where he could see the handwriting. Damien recognized the slant before he read a single word, and the recognition struck him with a force that made his face change in an instant. It was his mother's writing. Not a copy, not a forgery. The real, uneven script of a woman who had written with trembling hands and a heart she had never stopped protecting. Damien stared at it, and his voice, when it came, was barely more than a breath. She wrote this. Claire nodded once. She kept it hidden because she knew if the wrong person found it, it would disappear forever. Damien took the note from her as though it might vanish under his fingers. He read the first line, then the second, and then he stopped completely. The room held its breath with him. What his mother had written was not an accusation. It was a confession, a warning, and a plea wrapped into one. She had named the man who turned loyalty into betrayal. She had named the reason she had been forced away. And she had left one final instruction for the son she never stopped searching for. Trust the woman who brings you the envelope, because she has been telling you the truth all along. Damien lifted his eyes to Claire, and something in his expression cracked open at last. Not anger now, not pride, recognition. He saw, with terrible clarity, that she had not come to bargain for herself. She had come carrying the last piece of a family story that had been stolen before he was old enough to understand it. And as the silence deepened around them, Damien folded the note carefully in both hands, because the next name he was about to hear would lead him straight to the person who had erased his mother from his life. Before Damien could speak, Claire took one slow breath and slid the envelope across the polished table toward him. The room had gone so still that even the faint hum of the chandelier seemed louder than a heartbeat. Damien looked down at the envelope, then at her face, trying to read what she had not said aloud. Claire's hands were steady, but her eyes carried the weight of years no one in that room had earned the right to see. Open it, she said quietly, not as a request, as a truth that could no longer be delayed. Damien's fingers tightened around the paper, his jaw set in that controlled way that made men around him nervous and made women lower their voices without knowing why. He broke the seal and found a single photograph folded inside, its edges worn soft from being handled too many times. It was old, but not so old that the face in it had faded. Damien stared at the image, and for one suspended second, the whole room seemed to tilt around him. The woman in the photograph was young, smiling with the kind of bright, open expression that belonged to another life. And beside her, with a hand resting protectively at her waist, stood a man Damien had not seen in years. Not because he was gone, because someone had made sure he never knew to look for him. Damien's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low enough to feel dangerous even without anger. Claire did not flinch. "From the place your mother hid the truth," she said, "and from the man who thought he buried it." The words landed like a key turning in a locked door. Damien looked again at the photograph, and this time he noticed the detail that had escaped him before. The woman was wearing the same small locket Claire had kept tucked beneath her blouse, the one he had dismissed as ordinary because he had never known to ask. "That locket," he said. Claire reached beneath her collar and drew it out. It caught the light for a second, a simple piece of gold worn smooth by time and touch. "She gave it to me the night I was sent away," Claire said. "She told me that if anything ever happened to her, I was to keep it safe until her son was ready to hear the truth." Damien's face changed, just slightly, but Claire saw it. The first real fracture in the wall he had built around himself. He glanced at the photograph again, then back at her, and the cold certainty he had worn like armor began to give way to something more dangerous. Something human. "Who sent you away?" he asked. Claire hesitated only long enough for the room to feel the silence sharpen. Then she answered, "The same man who told your mother she had no right to keep you." Damien's fingers went still around the envelope. He was no longer looking at paper. He was looking at a trail, a hidden path that ran straight through the lies he had inherited. Claire could feel the moment the room shifted with him, as if every breath had moved one step closer to the truth. And when Damien finally lifted his eyes, they were no longer full of suspicion. They were full of a terrible, focused clarity. "Then start from the beginning," he said. Claire nodded once, slowly, because she knew that what came next would not just name the man who stole his mother's place in his life. It would lead him to the address written on the back of the photograph, and to the last person who still had answers hidden behind a locked door. Claire held the envelope so tightly that the edges pressed into her palm, but she did not pull away. She could feel Damien beside her, still as a statue, his attention fixed on the worn paper, as if it might suddenly speak. The room around them seemed to fade into a low, distant hum, the kind of hush that only comes when a hidden truth has finally found air. Damien opened the flap with careful fingers and slid out a single folded sheet, then a second. The first was a hospital record, yellowed at the corners. The second was a letter written in a shaking hand. Claire watched his face change as his eyes moved across the page, line by line, and for the first time since she had met him, the cold control in his expression began to crack. "This is from my mother," he said, almost to himself. His voice had gone rough. Claire did not answer. She knew better than to interrupt a man standing at the edge of his own past. Damien unfolded the letter fully, and the polished confidence that had ruled the room only minutes ago gave way to something older, something wounded. The paper was thin, the ink faded, but the words were unmistakable. A woman begging to keep her child. A woman writing that she had been told to disappear if she wanted him to survive. Damien's jaw tightened. He looked up once, then back down, as if rereading it might change the meaning. It did not. Claire stepped closer, careful and quiet. "There's more," she said, and when he turned, she reached into the envelope and drew out the photograph he had not seen yet. It was small and soft from years of being handled, the corners rounded with age. Damien took it, and the room seemed to narrow around the image. A young woman seated in a plain kitchen, her hand resting on the shoulder of a little boy with his father's eyes. On the back, in faded ink, were 4 words and an address. "Keep him away from Marcus." Damien stared at the name until it turned sharp in his mind. Claire could see the instant the memory struck him, not as a full picture, but as a fragment, a voice, a room, a door closing somewhere deep inside him. "Marcus," he repeated, and the name sounded like metal scraped across stone. Claire nodded once. "The address on the back is still active. I checked it this morning." Damien's gaze lifted to hers, and this time there was no arrogance in it. only urgency. You went there? Not yet, she said. But someone is still living there. He turned the photograph over again, as though the answer might be hidden in the fibers. Outside, a car passed on the street below, headlights flashing briefly across the window, then gone. Inside, the silence grew heavier. Damien slipped the letter back into the envelope with a care that looked almost reverent. Why would she keep this? He asked. Claire swallowed. Because she wanted you to know the truth before anyone else could bury it. Damien stood very slowly, like a man rising from a grave he had not known was open beneath him. His eyes moved once toward the locked door at the end of the hall, the place where the last answers still waited. And then he looked at Claire with a new kind of certainty, the kind that comes only after a lie has been torn apart and the first real road appears in its place. Get your coat, he said quietly. We're going to that address now. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Damien and Claire as they left the estate in silence, the envelope resting against Damien's palm like a live wire. The black SUV rolled through the city with its tinted windows and steady hum, but inside, neither of them spoke. Claire kept looking down at the papers as if they might disappear if she blinked too long, while Damien stared ahead with a jaw so tight it looked carved from stone. The address was an old row house on the south side of town, tucked between two boarded-up buildings and a shuttered laundromat, the kind of place most people drove past without a second glance. But when Damien saw the peeling number above the door, something in him went still. Claire noticed it at once. You know this place, she said softly. He did not answer right away. Instead, he took the envelope, opened it again, and pulled out the photograph she had handed him earlier. The woman in the picture wore a plain blue dress and stood beside a little boy with Damien's same dark eyes. On the back, in careful handwriting, there had been only one sentence. If anything happens to me, find him here. Claire watched his face harden, then crack, just barely, in the space of a breath. This is my mother's handwriting, he said, so low she almost missed it. She used to write like that when she was afraid someone would find her notes. The house at the address was dim, but not empty. A porch light flickered once, then steadied. Damien stepped out first, his coat moving with the cold air, and Claire followed, holding the envelope close to her chest. He knocked once, then again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a chain slid loose on the other side of the door, and an elderly woman with tired eyes opened it just wide enough to see them. Her gaze landed on Damien, and her face changed so quickly it looked like grief remembering itself. You finally came, she whispered. Damien's breath caught. Who are you? He asked. The woman's hand trembled on the doorframe, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of years. I'm the one who kept what your mother could not afford to lose. She stepped back and opened the door wider. Inside, the room smelled of old books, dust, and lavender. On the table sat a locked metal box, the kind used to protect documents no one was meant to see. Claire's pulse quickened as the woman placed a key in Damien's hand. Your mother knew the truth about the family business, she said, and she knew it would one day put a target on your back. Damien stared at the key, then at the box, and for the first time since leaving the estate, his face lost all its certainty. The old woman looked between them, her eyes glistening. She hid something here for you, she said. Something that changes not only who you are, but who has been lying to you all along. Damien turned the key over once, then lowered it toward the lock, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the box clicked open, revealing the name he had never expected to see. Damien's fingers tightened around the envelope as if the paper itself had a pulse. Claire stood beside him, her breath shallow, watching the name inside the open box as though it could vanish if she blinked. The room stayed unnaturally still, the kind of silence that only arrives when the truth has finally been cornered. Damien read the name once, then again, and his jaw set in a way Claire had never seen before. It was not the name of a business rival, or a forgotten associate, or some distant enemy looking to settle an old score. It was his own mother's name, written across a sealed set of documents tied in faded blue ribbon, and beneath it, in careful ink, a second line that made his expression harden, evidence of the trust account. For a moment, he said nothing. He only looked down at the envelope in Claire's hand, the one the old woman had insisted she give him before he opened the box. Claire swallowed, and slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, yellowed at the edges, the handwriting elegant and familiar enough to make Damien's throat tighten. His mother's voice seemed to rise from the page, steady and calm, as if she had known he would one day need these words more than air. Claire read the first line aloud under her breath, and every muscle in Damien's face changed. The letter named people he had trusted for years. It described meetings he had never been told about, signatures that should not have existed, and a hidden transfer of control that had been buried beneath layers of false records. Claire looked up at him, stunned, because the final line was not a warning but a confession. His mother had not only discovered the theft, she had anticipated the betrayal and prepared a path for him to reclaim everything, but only if he found the proof in time. Damien reached into the box again and lifted a second folder, heavier than it looked, with an address stamped in the corner. Not the estate, not the club, a private law office in downtown Chicago. Claire felt her chest tighten as he opened it and found copies of signatures, bank authorizations, and a notarized letter naming one person as the temporary custodian of the family holdings. Damien went still when he saw who that custodian had been. Not a stranger, not an outsider, someone close enough to stand at every table and smile through every lie. Claire saw the moment the realization hit him, because his eyes changed first, then the room around him seemed to lose all warmth. He looked at her once, almost as if he needed to make sure she was really there, and then back at the documents. "She trusted me to find this," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Claire nodded, unable to look away from the page in his hand. The old woman at the door took one careful step forward and pointed to the final sheet inside the folder, her voice soft but certain. "There is one more place," she said. "If you want the rest of the truth, you have to go there tonight." Damien looked at the address, then at the envelope marked with his mother's handwriting, and for the first time since the box opened, a different kind of silence settled over him. Not confusion, recognition, because the address was not random at all. It belonged to the place where the secret had begun, and the envelope in Claire's hands held the key to what his mother had died trying to protect. Damien's jaw tightened as he stared at the address again. The paper held so still in his hand that it seemed the whole room had fallen around it. Claire watched him from the side, her breath quiet, her fingers still resting on the envelope his mother had left behind. The old woman stood at the threshold with her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, her face lined with the kind of patience that only came from carrying a secret too long. "You recognize it," she said softly, not as a question but as a fact. Damien did not answer right away. The sunlight from the window cut across the desk in a pale gold strip, catching the edge of the envelope and the worn crease of the address label. For a moment, he looked less like the man who commanded rooms and more like a son standing at the edge of a memory he had spent years refusing to enter. "I haven't been there in 20 years, he said at last, his voice lower than before. Claire felt the shift in the air before she understood it. The address was not just a place on a page. It was a doorway, a locked one. "That building," Damien went on, folding the paper once with careful precision, "was my mother's last stop before she disappeared from my life." The old woman's eyes lowered, and in that small movement Claire understood that the truth was not only hidden in the envelope. It had been lived, feared, and guarded by people who had every reason to stay silent. Damien moved to the sideboard and poured himself a glass of water he never touched, his hand steady only because years of discipline refused to let it shake. "She used to say there were things no one could write down," he murmured. "Things that had to be handed over by someone you trust." He turned back to the envelope, then to Claire, as if measuring whether she could carry the next part of the truth. She had already risked too much, and yet her face held the same quiet resolve he had seen the first time she handed him the letter without asking for anything in return. "What is that place?" she asked. Damien looked at the address one more time, and the answer seemed to surface from somewhere deeper than memory. "A private archive," he said. "Not official, not on any public record. My mother used it when she wanted to protect names, dates, and evidence that could never survive in the open." The words landed slowly, each one changing the shape of the room. Claire felt the meaning before he finished speaking. This was not about inheritance anymore. This was about proof. About a paper trail someone had buried on purpose. about a woman who had known exactly how dangerous the truth could become when it fell into the wrong hands. The old woman took another step forward, her voice gentler now, almost tender. She told me if anyone ever came asking, they would know which door to open. Damien's eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time there was something like grief crossing his face, raw and unguarded. She knew someone would come, he said. She knew they would come after her was gone. Claire swallowed hard, thinking of the box, the letters, the careful handwriting on every folded page. Nothing about this had been accidental. Every piece had been placed with intention, as if his mother had been building a map through the dark and trusting that one day someone would still be able to follow it. Damien slid the envelope open with his thumb and drew out a smaller card tucked inside. Yellowed at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. Claire leaned closer and saw a second location. This one handwritten beneath the first in a line so faint it almost disappeared into the paper. Damien read it once, then looked up slowly, all trace of indecision gone. "This is where she wanted me to go tonight," he said. And when Claire saw the name on the card, she understood why his mother had hidden it so carefully, because the place waiting there was not just connected to the secret. It was the reason the secret had never been allowed to die. Damien stood in the hallway for one long second, the envelope still in his hand, as if the paper itself had pulsed with the last breath of a truth that had been waiting years to be found. Claire watched him carefully, her own heartbeat loud in the quiet, because she had seen enough by now to understand that whatever was inside that final location was not just a clue. It was a reckoning. When Damien finally moved, it was with the controlled certainty of a man who had crossed the line between suspicion and belief. He slipped the card into his pocket, looked at Claire, and for the first time that night, the hardness in his face gave way to something raw and human. "Stay close," he said, not as a command this time, but as a promise. The drive took them out of the glittering center of the city and toward the older part of town, where the streets narrowed, the buildings wore their age honestly, and the light from the windows felt softer somehow, less like display and more like memory. Claire sat beside him in the back seat, her fingers folded tightly in her lap, watching the passing storefronts blur into dark glass and brick. Damien did not speak much. He kept one hand near the folder in his coat, the other resting still against his knee, but Claire could see the tension in the line of his jaw. He was not going to this place as the man the city feared. He was going as the son of a woman who had loved him enough to leave breadcrumbs through the dark. When the car finally stopped, Claire looked up and saw a small chapel at the end of a quiet lot, its white paint weathered by years of sun and rain, its cross simple and unadorned against the night sky. There were no crowds, no flashing lights, no grand entrance. Just a narrow path lit by old iron lamps and a single front door standing half in shadow. Damien got out first and waited for her. "This was her church," he said quietly. Before everything changed, Claire followed him inside, and the air shifted immediately. It smelled faintly of wood polish, candle wax, and old hymnals. The sanctuary was small, warm, and nearly empty, with rows of polished pews and stained glass that caught the moonlight in muted colors. At the front, beneath the cross, stood an elderly woman in a gray cardigan, her hands folded over a Bible worn soft at the edges. She looked up when Damien entered, and her expression changed at once, surprise giving way to sorrow, so deep it seemed to have been waiting for him. "You came," she said, her voice trembling. Damien stopped a few feet away. "You knew she was still keeping things from me." The woman lowered her eyes, then nodded once. "Your mother asked me to wait. She said one day you'd come looking for the truth, and when you did, you would need somewhere sacred to hear it." Claire felt the weight of that sentence settle over the room. Damien's face did not move, but something in his eyes shifted, as if a lock had turned inside him. The woman reached for a small metal key hanging from a ribbon at her wrist and held it out. "The envelope led you here because this is where she stored the rest," she said. "Not money, not secrets for power. Something she was protecting until the right time." Damien took the key, and his hand tightened around it so slowly it was almost painful to watch. Claire stepped closer, unable to help herself, and noticed then the framed photograph on a side table near the pews. It was old, the corners faded, but unmistakable. Damien as a boy, maybe 8 or 9, standing beside his mother in front of this same chapel, both of them smiling like the future had never taught them fear. His breath caught. The room seemed to hold still around him. "She used to bring me here," he whispered. "I forgot." The woman looked at him with wet eyes. "No, Mr. Russo. She never forgot. That was the point." She led them to a side room behind the altar, where a narrow cabinet stood beneath a small crucifix. Inside were letters, journals, and a second envelope marked with Damien's name in the same careful handwriting Claire had seen before. His mother had not left behind a mystery for the sake of drama. She had left a record, a final witness. Damien opened the envelope with reverent hands and found pages full of dates, names, transactions, and one truth after another laid bare in his mother's steady script. Not betrayal, as he had feared. Protection. She had spent years keeping record of the people who had threatened the family. The money quietly moved to keep others safe. The names of those who had helped and those who had turned away. At the center of it all was one sentence underlined twice in blue ink. "Do not let the past make you cruel." Damien stared at the words for a long time. Claire saw his throat move as he swallowed, saw the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction, as if the anger he had carried for so long had finally found a shape it could not conquer. He looked down at the pages again, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than before. "She knew I would become this." The woman beside them answered gently. "She knew you could choose not to." That was the moment the room changed. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because Damien understood what his mother had really been building all along. Not an inheritance of power, a path back to himself. He set the pages on the table, turned away, and for one brief second Claire thought he might break under the weight of it all. Instead, he closed his eyes, took a long breath, and when he opened them again, the man standing in the chapel looked older, softer, and strangely free. He turned to Claire. "I need to make things right," he said. Claire nodded, because she understood now that this was the real end of the story they had been carried through. Not a victory of force, a return to conscience. When they stepped back outside, the night air felt clean against their faces, and the city beyond the chapel seemed far away, almost irrelevant. Damien stood under the iron lamp while the warm light touched the lines of his face, and for the first time since this all began, he looked less like a man trapped by his name and more like a son who had finally heard his mother clearly. He folded the last letter carefully and placed it inside his coat. Then he turned toward Claire and, in a voice that had lost all its threat, said, "Tonight changes everything." And it did. Because by morning, the truth his mother had guarded in silence would no longer belong to the shadows, and the man who had once spoken like ownership had learned, at last, how to listen.